Hello and welcome back to the Skype sessions. Today we have another guest coming on, and it's one of the co-hosts from one of my favorite podcasts, Classical Stuff You Should Know. And I think it's classical stuff that all of our listeners should know, because in order to understand Lewis, you really have to understand the classical world. So to talk about his podcast and what they do there, please welcome Graeme. Graeme,
hi.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.
So Graeme, please tell us a little bit about your podcast, Classical Stuff You Should Know.
Yeah, so Classical Stuff You Should Know started with, we're three guys. We work at a classical Christian school. And so classical schools are probably, I think, still one of the fastest growing sort of education initiatives in the U.S. And so it started with AJ and I, who work at this school in Austin, Texas, called Veritas Academy. And we had co-taught a bunch of classes. He did his degree up at Whitworth College in the Pacific Northwest. I did my degree, I'm from Canada. I did my degree at the University of Toronto. Opposite sides of the continent, but sort of having both similar styles of education, with C.S. Lewis being sort of prominent from childhood through university, and then teaching at a classical school. You don't get very far until you wade into the Dorothy Sayers, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien world of talking about how literature forms virtue. So anyway, so AJ and I are in this world. We love this. And we just decided, just for fun, I think it was like 2017, that we would just throw together a couple of our lectures into podcasts. And then Magby started working at the school, and then all three. And then when we got him on the podcast about episode 9, it was just that dynamic of the three of us together clicked. Whereas when it was just AJ and I think those old episodes are pretty cringy. But when it was when Thomas was there, we just sort of had this dynamic that clicked really well. And so the podcast is, it's called Classical Stuff. We don't stick to the ancient world. We move up through it's more the classical pedagogy. So we're three people that really want to rediscover those old ways of reading books, and just like giving literature the preeminence, and sort of, instead of tearing it down because of our modern sensibilities, letting those old books sort of really inform us. I think one of the big guiding principles of the podcast is when Lewis talks about how reading old books can sort of illuminate cultural blind spots. Mm-hmm. So as modern people, we may value certain things culturally and have completely forgotten old valuations of things. The big one being that he mentions in his book, like honor. We're not a really big honor-based society. We're in a lot more of a grace and shame kind of people. Anyway, so AJ and I started this podcast because we just wanted to have a place to sort of point our students to for lectures.
Extra credit.
And then also, yeah. And then it keeps us sharp. Like we got to come up with an episode every 3 weeks. So that means we're always reading, we're always writing, we're always like saying like, oh crap, we got to figure out something to say. So we better not just be reading garbage in our spare time, but we better sort of take an intellectual life seriously.
I would love to see you guys do an episode on Dan Brown. Just try and pull it apart from a classical point of view.
Oh my word, Hamburg would have a field day.
It's a very similar experience for me on our podcast as well, because we're producing episodes at least once a week. It means that I have to be reading, and also I have to be reading carefully, Lewis, because I got to talk about this one chapter for an hour.
Yeah.
Next season, I put it to our Patreon supporters, and it was enthusiastically received. One of the things that I want to do next season is have a Lewis's Bookshelf month, or maybe 2 months even, where we spend some time going through the books which influenced Lewis, which helped build that virtue, which helped build that worldview. We've got a couple of episodes coming up about Lewis and the medieval mind, the medieval world, and we see how much that affected him. And this is what I love about your podcast, because my education was expensive and incredibly lacking. And so there are huge swathes of literature that I have not read, that I wasn't even exposed to. And through your podcast, I'm actually starting to dig into some of the classics after I've heard three guys talk about it. And it's like, it doesn't seem that hard.
Well, that's very flattering. That's what we hope is the takeaway. We hope that it's like, oh, Paradise Lost seems kind of fun. And then 2 books in, you're like, this thing's a nightmare. And then you come back and you sort of wrestle through it and work through it. And but yeah, the concept of Lewis's bookshelf is that's a fun one. So what, if I can ask the host a question, what are the like the top sort of contenders? When you guys thought this idea, what were you like, we've got to do this, we've got to do this?
Well, Lewis himself, he was interviewed by the Christian Century for the top 10 books which shaped his, I think we called it vocation and worldview, something like that. And so we will almost certainly go through those. And so I think that's Fantasties. We've had an episode on Fantasties before, but that's something else I want to do next month. Next season, I want to have an entire month on George MacDonald, because the more I read of him, the more I'm really liking him. But we'll have Fantasties, and then you go into the classical world, things like Boethius. I know he's sort of a bridge, but Boethius seems to have really affected him. When I interviewed Dr. Baxter about the medieval mind of C.S. Lewis, he said Lewis wanted to be a British Boethius, which is really interesting. But to really understand what that means, you need to know who this Boethius guy was and the kind of things that he talked about. Lewis, I think he also put the Ennead, and basically all those classical adventure stories. I kind of want to go through each of those because, you know, you go through things like The Great Divorce and Narnia, and there are allusions there if you know what other books he's read. Yeah. And they come thick and fast. Things like The Fairy Queen as well by Spencer. So really we're going to try and get through the entire Western canon in probably 2 months, which I think is totally doable. I don't know why you guys have been taking so long.
Yeah, aim high. That sounds awesome. That sounds like definitely a noble and a worthy thing to go through for sure. I look forward to hearing what you guys come up with.
I'm just pulling up. I have people that know me will know that I like to plan, and on the podcast they keep joking about Batesian rigidity. So I actually have a little Trello board. So we had G.K. Chesterton as well. We've had one episode on Chesterton, but I'd like to do one, say, specifically on the Everlasting Man. And since my wife runs Pints with Chesterton, I might get her to do that. Dorothy Sayers, you mentioned her already. I think probably maybe get Crystal Downing to do that. Shakespeare. There's Sarah Waters. She's done lots of work on that. Charles Williams, one of Lewis's friends. His stuff is interesting and crazy.
His stuff's bonkers. I remember reading him when I was writing. I did my grad degree on Till We Have Faces, and you get into the whole romanticism world. And I remember reading him, being like, "Whoa, it was weird." I didn't end up leaning on him heavily, but that was just the impression that 21-year-old me had, which was. The deeper you go, the more you realize that there's just there's no end to books.
Also on my list is T.S. Eliot. I know Father Dwight Longenecker has done a book about Lewis and Eliot. Lewis's favorite mystic, Lady Julian of Norwich. Dante, of course, because Plato. I was thinking of getting Dr. Louis Markos, and then I've got Boethius. On the Incarnation by St. Athanasius, and then Augustine. Those. That's what I have in my little scratch pad at the moment.
I mean, you hear that list and you wonder how Lewis avoided becoming a Catholic. Like, I mean, that's just when you think about it. Like, you have Boethius. Like, if Julian of Norwich is someone that's so strong, G.K. Chesterton. I guess maybe George MacDonald. George MacDonald was maybe the guy that kept him on this side of the title.
I'm not sure. Aside from that little bit of universalism, and even in the Eastern Fathers, you have some elements of that.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
It's funny. This conversation has come up quite a lot because when I've ever given talks on Lewis to a Catholic audience, that's always the question that they ask. And this past month, we've had Ecumenism Month. So I interviewed an Eastern Orthodox professor, a Mormon missionary, a Presbyterian Calvinist, a Baptist Provisionist, and an Orthodox Jew to ask them what it is that they like about Lewis so much. And I think that in some ways answers at least some of the question as to why he didn't jump around denominations. Just he was really focused on some very core truths Actually, Saint Pope John Paul the Great. Too many definitions. Saint Pope John Paul the Great. He said to Walter Hooper, who was Lewis's secretary, that man knew what his apostolate was, and he went and did it. And his apostolate was mere Christianity, refuting naturalism. That was his focus. But it's fun to have some conversations about Lewis and denominations, why everyone wants to claim him, and specifically why he didn't ever become Catholic, because he gives us a few reasons. But also at the same time, this is a guy who corresponded quite literally with a saint. St. Calabria was beatified, and we have his Latin letters that he exchanged with C.S. Lewis. Crazy.
Yeah.
Now, on the show, you guys have done some C.S. Lewis books, and you mentioned your interest in Till We Have Faces, which is a very divisive book on our podcast. Because Andrew thinks it's Lewis's best book, as he keeps quoting Lewis, far and away my best book. And Matt and I are more sensible people and go with The Great Divorce, because it's clearly superior. But I'm interested, what are your thoughts on Till We Have Faces? I'm just going to give you the floor.
Sure. Till We Have Faces... I'm never one to make the greatest book, worst book. AJ on the podcast is much. He's definitely the guy that digs into the conversations about literary style and where does this sit up in the canon and that kind of stuff. Till We Have Faces for me was it's doing similar kinds of things that he tried to do in Pilgrim's Regress. Where and I think Pilgrim's Regress is kind of a little on the nose, and Till We Have Faces is asking sort of similar questions or talking about similar concepts and doing it in that more. It's pretty deep allegorical style. I've taught it to 10th graders, and until they have some kind of break through the armor onto the inside, they don't really know what's going on. They don't really know what's at stake. They know that you can read the story and you can like the story about the queen, and she sort of is reclaiming her kingdom, but the ending and her main grievance don't really make sense unless you have some kind of break onto the inside. And the thing that what for me was that break when I was first reading it in undergrad and then deciding that I was going to do my dissertation on it, was that it is Lewis's a story where he is trying to answer the problem of romanticism. And that problem of romanticism that he talks about in his biography, his autobiography, where he mentions you have those romantic experiences. Young people, sometime in your life, you have these moments of where it seems as if time stopped, the world opens up, and you are being whispered into this deeper reality of the world. That famous line he has there's a hunger that's awakened in your soul, and if you can't find something that satisfies it in this world, the conclusion is that you were made for another world, right? That famous line of his. And so that problem of you have some sort of deep experience of joy. I think, in my 10th grade literature class, when we get to romanticism, I just call it deep joy for the kids to be able to understand it. And so there are these moments of deep joy. Lewis had it when he was a little kid when he was sick, and his brother gave him that, I think it was like a mason jar lid with a little garden in it.
I think it was biscuit
or something like that.
It was more. It was more British than that.
Oh yeah, I've Americanized the story. Yeah, it had a cactus in there. No. And that sort of, he wanted to be a little person living in that perfect garden, and he's he said, if you'd asked me what my heart desired, I would have said that's what I wanted. But even by saying it, I would have realized that was silly. You don't really want to live in a biscuit tin. Anyway, so this feeling that you have that you were made for this other world, that your heart has this deep longing for something, and then it flees, and then it leaves you, and you're kind of left in this wasteland, which is why I think he likes Eliot, because this is what Eliot's doing in the wasteland, and what a lot of the Romantic poets are talking about. Whither has fled the visionary gleam, right? The Wordsworth line. This was a thing that really rocked Lewis's boat. Was you have these feelings where things feel so strong, and you feel like yes, this is the universe I was made for, and this is what I want to live for. and then it's gone, and you're kind of in your regular, ordinary, boring life, like doing your taxes or whatever. Anyway, so for Lewis, from my understanding of it, is that those were almost like God's natural homing beacon that he's put in our hearts that gets stirred up every now and then in these moments and experiences of beauty, and then the honest soul needs to sort of follow that beauty to its source. And if you do so, it'll bring you to it'll at least bring you to the place where you need to repent. And so Lewis does that. So that's what I call the romantic problem, and that's this big thing that really was part of Lewis's conversion. And then what I think he's doing until we have faces is he's taking that romantic problem, the fact that you have this deep feeling of longing for joy, and he personifies that in the book in the character of Psyche, the beautiful sister. And then the beautiful sister gets married to God and is taken away, and the queen is left feeling like the gods are jerks. All they do is they put us in this world to mess with us and to give and to like dangle beautiful things in front of us, dangle like a full life just to take it away. And then so the queen has, whose name no one can pronounce. Then the queen has these grievances that she wants to air to the gods. And then at the end of the book, you have that really sort of strange ending where she doesn't get to air her grievances. Well, she does. She actually gets to air the real grievances that she has. So until you sort of, that to me was sort of the breakthrough, was that I realized, wait a minute, I think Lewis is trying to work out his take on this romantic problem using a myth and using a story. And whether or not he's successful is a debatable point. Whether or not you think that's too esoteric is maybe a debatable point as well. And I think that's where people get tripped up. They're like, I don't know what's going on. This book's weird. Romantic problem, whatever. Like, what's the deal with the queen? Whereas read at the sort of at the tail end of doing a deep dive on his own thoughts about romanticism and how the soul can come to desire God before maybe even being catechized, or desire God maybe even before being sort of like given some sort of like tangible gospel to really wrestle with. I think that's what he's doing in that book, is he's talking about how these romantic longings that we experience in beauty ultimately can bring us to the place where they break us, and then they bring us to the place where we can sort of realize that we're longing for not Psyche, but Psyche's husband. Anyway, so that was my, I attempted to sort of connect those dots in what I was working on. So that's my take on it. And
I'll be sure to put a link in the show notes to that episode. But
yes, please do. That's fun.
It's funny that you talk about that. I don't disagree with a lot of it. The only other thing is, though, there's also so much other stuff that's going on in this book. And I think this is why it drops down to a second place for me, because I think he's trying to do too much. Or at least there's so much stuff there, because I would say it's easily his deepest book. There's so much stuff to plumb, because he's also dealing with the issue of the goodness of the gods. Are they actually good? Do they want our good? Are they beautiful? If so, how? And this past season, we've been going through the four loves. And so I naturally put that set of lenses over the top of this book. And you see distorted love everywhere. So, Orwell, that's how I'm pronouncing it. And I have a podcast, so I should know.
You're British, so you get you get to trump the pronunciation on that.
This is true. But she opens up by saying about how she is unloved. She doesn't have a husband. She doesn't have a friend. She basically works through the four loves, that she doesn't have love of the gods. She doesn't have agape. She doesn't have friendship. She doesn't have philia. She doesn't have, a romance. She doesn't have bonds, because Psyche's been taken away from her. So the primary lens that I look at that book through is through a meditation on love, and how Orwell keeps messing things up, keeps taking good things and twisting them. But at the same time, finds this redemption such that at the very end, Well, I'm not going to get into Andrew's theory about what Aurora writes, but I think he's right. But the fact you have this transformation going on in her through the book as well, and the fact you have all these things going on inside this book, it's what makes it great, and it's what makes it really frustrating.
Yes, I think that's perceptive to superimpose four loves on it. That makes tons of sense based on the characters. Yeah, I agree. To me, the line that sparked my curiosity about the book was "You too shall be Psyche."
I thought it was going to be "Why should our hearts not dance?"
Oh yeah, no, it was "You too shall be Psyche." That you've got this sort of, in the end, the joy or the sort of the deep longing that you were longing for, you don't get, you become. And that's a really interesting, that might be, maybe some like Dante getting to the top of heaven stuff going on there. And anyway, also, yes, definitely the deepest book. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, and also very Charles Williamsy. It was only after I understood his idea of participation that suddenly the last part, I just happened to read about it about a month before I got to part 2 of Till We Have Faces, and suddenly it made far more sense that when Williams hears St. Paul say that, we can carry one another's burdens, that we are part of one body, that he took that really, really, really seriously. And so the idea that one person could carry another person's burdens, and when you look in Lewis's life, that he prayed that to take some of the burdens of his wife as she was having bone cancer, and he started losing calcium as she started gaining it, which is wild.
That is very wild. Huh. I hadn't heard that story before. That's freaky in a good way. Yes.
Well, and whether it's true or not, and personally I'm leaning towards the side that it's true, it's what we often do with the Bible. We are very too quick to offer context, to make the clause a little less sharp. So when Jesus talks about radical forgiveness, radical charity, we're always very quick to say, well, there's got to be within some certain parameters. And I'm not denying that those are true, but I think that it would do our souls some good to sit with just the radical command to begin with before we start trying to say, well, okay, maybe not quite so seriously.
Yeah. Just as you were talking, it made me think the other thing that Lewis is also doing is his big drawing the lines between the classical world and then the Christian world, and how a lot of he's got that maybe pretty contentious belief that God reveals himself to the Jews in the temple and in the law. He fully reveals himself in the person of Christ, but he also partially has revealed himself to the pagans in the classical world. And so maybe he's doing, I haven't spent any time really digging in and thinking through this, but maybe that's also something what he's trying to do with these, with this myth that gets, sort of misinterpreted by the people. And then the queen's like, that's not what happened. So maybe he's trying also to sort of talk a little bit about like, the myths that we have, the golden bough and all these kinds of things, where he's trying to say, listen, there are sort of seeds of the faith here that aren't just because they're coming from like perceptive people, but because it's part of revelation. Mm-hmm. And that, there was, this was at the time, and he's writing this at the time, where other theologians are completely dismissing all sorts of ideas of sort of like that natural theology or that sort of revelation that comes, I think, like maybe Karl Barth comes to mind with that kind of thing. But anyway, so you're right in saying that Till We Have Faces has lots going on, and so, which is why my 10th graders kind of get cross-eyed every time I teach it. So
I couldn't imagine trying to read that book that young. I just don't know how you'd even try. But that's
they're bright. They're kids.
But that's the other thing on the podcast. I hear about some of the things that your kids are reading, and I just don't know how. I mean, these are books that I struggled with in my 20s and 30s and still don't really understand.
Oh, they struggle with them. It's not that they don't struggle. It's just that we force them to struggle. Mm. But yes, it is, our curriculum it's a pretty high bar of reading. But we don't do a lot of hand-holding, but we do a lot of discussion. We do a lot of reading in class. It's amazing how much, for example, of Milton you get when you can actually learn to phrase it out loud properly. If you just sort of sit in your chair and try to read it in your head, it's really hard. If you can, it's almost when you get to that performative level. So, I mean, yeah. And we have varying levels of success based on the books that we do. But yes, the reading curriculum at Veritas is it's pretty fun.
But that also actually gets to a point that I keep making whenever anyone's talking about reading a new book, particularly a Lewis book or a book that I've read that I thought, that's really difficult. I always say, A, read it slowly, and B, read it in community. Because it's only when you start bouncing off other people that a lot of this stuff even starts to make sense.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I tell my students, any harbor in a storm, right? Like if you need to go read a summary online, go read that summary. You need to read some of this. So, yeah, if you need to go and watch a video on it, some YouTube video that some kid made, like go for it. But you're also not going to get out of actually reading the text out loud to each other in class and then having to debate some of the issues and the questions that come up. So, but yes, it's that reading community I think is a good, it is a necessary point for this kind of stuff. Yeah, Lewis and his Inklings, right? Like getting together in the pub and talking about these things. Podcasts and the sort of like podcast movement renaissance thing that everybody's going through right now is, I think, a big rediscovery of that.
Particularly of the long form idea. Yeah, when I think when I think of the resources that were available to me as a kid, it was always a summary. That if you wanted to get a book to understand a text that you were wrestling with, it was generally as short as possible. And now I can go and listen to podcasts where a bunch of people are taking their time, slowly working their way through a text. And people are actually kind of lapping up that content. I'm always slightly amazed when I find someone has gone back and say binged one of the early seasons because their book group was reading the Screwtape Letters, so they went through our entire season in a week. Speaking of reading community, what are you guys going to be doing soon? Because I know you plan things up well in advance.
Yeah. We've had lots of people requesting that the Plantagenet series continues on. So maybe about 2 years ago, I did kind of from the White Ship till, where did I stop? Maybe Richard? I can't remember.
Maybe?
No, maybe Henry III. No, there was Edward. No, we had the Black Prince. Where are we at? We must be right towards the War of the Roses. Anyway, so we've had lots of requests for the War of the Roses, which I'm somewhat hesitant to do because I think people think it's a lot more exciting than it is. It's like, well, and these guys got really mad and went and they killed everybody up in York, and then all the York people got really mad and they went and killed everybody. So, but anyway, I've made enough promises now that I've said, okay, I will go and I'll do a War of the Roses series. So I need to brush up on that. Magby is continuing to go through Herodotus. And it would not surprise me if he jumps into Thucydides afterwards, just because, why not? And then Hannibal, he's the wild card. I mean, who knows where he's going to go? That man, I was surprised when he did Joyce's Ulysses.
Yes, me too.
It was a bomb. He was like a weird ghost for those 2 months when he was reading the book, and I'm not sure where he's going next.
He does seem to enjoy the books. Like, what does it mean? It's like, I don't know.
Yeah, he's like, it doesn't matter. This is weird. So we now, like the school year is ending. We've got a little bit more runway to do things. I've been reading also. Oh gosh, the name escapes me. We just did the episode on it the Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and which is a book that's basically talking about a lot of these issues that we're talking here of romanticism, like what happens when romanticism becomes the dominant, if not not everybody's walking around with like Rousseau in their heads, but everybody is pretty much functionally romantic in their ethics and in their sort of framing of issues. And so going through that is sort of bleeding into a bunch of different episodes. I think I've got a Wordsworth episode coming up where he's talking about sort of young Wordsworth and old Wordsworth, and how really relying on those experiences of deep joy actually aren't enough to get you through the difficult sort of psychological things that happen in our lives, whereas young Wordsworth thought it was. So there's lots of fun stuff coming up.
And that is one person that we will have to add to Lewis's bookshelf, Wordsworth, because he's quoted him a bunch in the Four Loves. Mm-hmm. There's never any end. Never any end.
Spilled religion is what he calls Wordsworth and his romanticism, the spilled religion, right? Mm. Oh yeah, and this was big for me when I was in college with Lewis. Was we did a series on the abolition of man, and those books were both big for AJ and myself becoming sort of intellectually, for me at least, intellectually satisfied. I actually changed my degree from a philosophy degree to an English degree, because when I read Abolition of Man, it was a fun story. I was way in the far north of Canada, like working at a Bible camp. I was reading Abolition of Man. I had done 2 years, and I was doing like a philosophy specialist, taking all the classes. I read Abolition of Man, and I closed it that summer, and I was like, well, I'm satisfied. And I logged on a dial-up internet to my university college portal, and I dropped all of my philosophy classes, and I changed my specialist philosophy degree. By that point I had enough to have it be my major, so I kept it as my major, and I tacked on a bunch of literature classes because of Abolition of Man. But that led me into reading Lewis as as a serious literary academic. So the discarded image, the allegory of love, the experiment in criticism, and also he edited, what was it, the Oxford Companion to English Literature or something like that? The 16th century? 17th century?
Since we're video.
Uh-oh, I chased you away.
This I found for $1.
Awesome. Oh my God.
At the local library.
That's insane.
Haven't read it yet.
Awesome. Oh. So when I started reading those, then I realized, like, wait a minute, this isn't just somebody who's like, your youth pastor gives you mere Christianity to the brainy kid who's asking a lot of questions. Like, Lewis isn't just the person for that kid to read. This is some serious academic chops going on, and so I think I'm gonna, if you're talking about classical stuff, I want to do some episodes on that, because Lewis is, if not one of the last great true literary critics before we move into the more modern hermeneutics of contempt kind of thing that we're in right now, which is like, why read Shakespeare when he's like old and misogynist or whatever? When I was an undergrad, I was like, the university, Canada is sort of behind everything when it comes to movements. And so undergrad in the early 2000s, we hadn't really had the same kind of cultural moment that you have in humanities courses in the United States in terms of those kinds of I like the phrase, the hermeneutic of contempt, which is, who said that? I can't remember. Harold Bloom. That was Harold Bloom's line. But reading Lewis and realizing, wait, there's a methodology here of interpreting and analyzing literature on a high academic level that's still incredibly readable and is incredibly fruitful. I teach Paradise Lost every year, and I heavily rely on his introduction to Paradise Lost, which is not, this is a book that he wrote for, the Academy. So, diving into, you were talking about, medieval cosmology and Lewis being influenced by that, like Discarded Image and Allegory of Love. Those are sleeper books of his. I love those ones. Those are fantastic reads. And, I think the methodology of what he's doing when he's talking about literature in those books is something that, needs a bit of a renaissance in discussing, literature, because we have kids, they go to our classical school, they go to our English classes, they're like, oh man, I love English, I'm going to go be an English major. And we're like, oh, I don't think I can do that. And then they go to major state university and they take English classes and they're miserable because they're dogging on these authors. And they're saying that, like, you know, can you have a methodology that can, like, tear down the books? Can you sort of point out how they are unpalatable to modern tastes and write a paper about it? And our students, when they go to do English degrees, are like, oh, this isn't fun. This seems like almost cruel. It's like, and so those sorts of books, and realizing that if there isn't, it's hidden somewhere. It's like hidden in small Christian colleges somewhere. But that ability to do high-level academic criticism on these works and not just sort of rely on these really corrosive tools of interpretation, I think is an important piece of Lewis's legacy that needs to get a lot more airplay. Yeah. His apologetics, I mean, they're great, but yeah.
No, I think you're right, and I love that phrase, the hermeneutic of what did you call it?
A hermeneutic of contempt.
Contempt. Mm-hmm. Because it's the we murder to dissect, that every book we come to, we're coming to judge it. Mm-hmm. And one of the wonderful things about Lewis is, and he does this himself, and he tells us to do it explicitly in things like experimenting criticism, that you sort of use it as a pair of spectacles to look through the world in a different way. And he loved authors where he loved certain parts of them, but disliked the message. And he could pick those things apart and say what they were doing that was good, what they were doing that was bad, and offer some kind of holistic view of it. Whereas, as you point out, modern literary criticism, it's judging everything. And this season, we're going to be reading The Horse and His Boy. And I don't think there's a Lewis book that has come in for more contempt than that book. And the thing that I keep saying to people whenever I come across them, that they hate it so much, is like, just read the book as itself first of all. Just give yourself over to the book and the story, and then we can start talking about some of these other things before you start immediately projecting your own opinions on it and just ripping it to shreds. Because it's my favorite Narnia book, because I think it's his best.
Oh, yeah.
Well, maybe not his best. It's definitely my favorite.
Now, I have one question for you, which is, where do you land on the Planet Narnia theory?
I am pretty sold on it. Are you
familiar with this?
Yeah, we've had Dr. Ward on the show. I am pretty sold on it. I'm quite happy for somebody to quibble around the edges as to quite how explicit it was meant to be. But the more of Lewis I read, the more I see of the medieval planets. You can't read the discarded image and not realize this was really important to him. You definitely can't read the Ransom trilogy, his sci-fi trilogy, without realizing that this is clearly what he has in mind. And so to then take that and move it over to Narnia doesn't seem like a stretch at all to me. Yeah. And for me, just to explain for anyone that's watching this that hasn't encountered this before, Dr. Michael Ward, he has this theory that each of the Narnian Chronicles is based on one of the seven heavens of the medieval cosmos. So, for example, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, since it's dawn, that's all about Sol, the sun. Whereas The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that's all about Jupiter, and which goes a long way to explaining why you have Father Christmas there, because he is the quintessential, the archetypal, jovial character. And for me, it solves some problems, like Father Christmas, and also the thing that tips me over the edge is the counterfactuals. So if I personally was writing the Chronicles of Narnia, and in Prince Caspian, the children come back to Narnia, where they were once kings and queens, and they are in the ruins of their old castle, and they discover a chess piece, I can tell you that the piece that they're going to find is either a king or a queen or the castle. But what does Lewis have them find? He has them find a knight, because that is the martial book. So put all of that together. I'm fairly convinced. I'm happy for someone to say, I think this little bit of it is pushing it a little far. But I think the essential thesis is right.
I kind of want to know how the idea, like the light bulb moment for him when he realized, the author who wrote it, Dr.
Michael Ward. I know this story.
Michael Ward.
He was reading Lewis's poetry.
Because I figured it was like in the pub you're talking about. You're like, oh my goodness, this is the planets. It's like, oh, maybe I had 3 pints too many or something.
Let me just see if I can find the exact line. No. Okay, so this is going to be a paraphrase. So he was late at night. He was reading Lewis's poetry. He was actually in the kilns, I think, because he was doing his postgraduate work on Lewis. And he was reading his poetry, and he came across the line about winter gone and guilt forgiven. And he thought, that sounds kind of like Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. If you're going to sum it up, winter gone and guilt forgiven. And then he started looking into the other books, and then he started seeing these parallels, because Lewis actually wrote a poem called The Planets. And he started realizing that there was actually quite a good deal that was mapping onto each of these books. And we actually even have a textual relic that I think is also a superb piece of proof. If you remember in the books, Father Time is underground, and the children see him as they're coming up. We don't have many of Lewis's original drafts, but in one of the original drafts, he doesn't call him Father Time. He calls him the great god Saturn. And this great god Saturn makes his real appearance in the final book of the series, in the last battle, when everything is wrapped up. So I'm willing to fight people on it, but at the same time, I think whether you believe in that theory or not, the big thing that I think it did for a lot of people was it introduced them to medieval cosmos, the discarded image, the Ransom trilogy, and starting to think about how the books that Lewis read shaped his mind and shaped the way that he himself wrote. You could even go so far as to argue that it was all entirely subconscious. I don't think it was. But you do start noticing an awful lot about the medieval cosmology as you're reading Narnia.
I mean, I attribute any kind of knowledge that I have to symbolic landscapes of any sort of medieval understanding to the reading the Narnia Chronicles so much as a kid. So much so that, like, knowing that the winged messenger of Mercury and having the horse and his boy be that book is all about, like, we got to go. I just remember even when I was a kid, the emotion that I had reading that book is a little bit of, like, kind of anxiety, getting chased, where people are nipping at our heels. We just got to keep moving. We got to keep going. And then having that be, like, sort of mercurial, right? Like, so even if it is subconscious, which I don't think it is, it has given for kids that are steeped in those books reading it, when they get into reading about the medieval cosmology, they're like, when characters show up, they expect it because it makes sense, right? Like, the sort of the joviality of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, which is my favorite book growing up.
Really?
Sort of the martial nation. I know.
I'm not judging. I'm not judging. It's surprising.
I know it's not on everyone's big list. I just loved Dr. Cornelius. So I remember. So as a kid growing up in Canada, the faith Christianity is not big. Like, we don't have the same kind of church culture in the United States. Some, for good or for ill. And I just remember being like a kid growing up, feeling like I was partaking in this, like, underground, not like subversive, but definitely these old ways that no one cared about anymore. And so having Dr. Cornelius, he was a big figure in my life. In fact, young me in college wanted to be Dr. Cornelius when he grew up. I wanted to be this teacher who was working in the world of, not influence and power, but I wanted to be, like, teaching people who cared about learning, like Prince Caspian, but also was this, like, secret follower of the way. Anyway, so that was a big formative book for me. But reading Narnia and having all of those images together, and even what I liked about Planet Narnia was even the adjectives they get into, looking at the diction of each book. To say that, listen, the adjectives that Lewis uses is in service to not only the feel but the symbolism of that medieval cosmology. So I always like to ask Lewis scholars if they're on that or if they think it's like crazy talk.
Well, I'm not a scholar. I'm definitely an amateur, and proud of that title because it just means one who loves. But yeah, yes. I'm kind of sold, and I think it shows what an evocative writer that Lewis is. What Dr. Ward calls Donigality. He is great at producing an environment. Well, this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to the coming episodes, and I'm looking forward to stealing one or all of you to come back on next season so we can actually start looking at some old books.
Yeah, if you let me know, and the thing that I could offer is sort of the Paradise Lost aspect of it, just because I'm so familiar with his introduction because I've taught it for the last 10 years. But
okay,
but again,
sold.
I'm an amateur too. I'm no scholar. So
that's the best kind of person, in my opinion. Can you tell people where they can find classical stuff you should know?
Yes. So classical stuff you should know. We are on place where you get a podcast, Spotify. We have a YouTube channel where we set up us recording at school. Classical stuff on Twitter, CLSSCAL stuff.
Hardest Twitter handle ever.
The guy who has classical stuff won't give it to us. And you can email us at theguys@classicalstuff.net. But people know where to find podcasts. Just Google around, you'll find us.
Excellent. I'll put some links in the show notes. Graeme Donaldson, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
And everyone, please join us next time when we'll go further up, further in. Cheers.